fit. So we were on a weekday, somewhere between a third and a little bit more, if I compare it to the previous year. And at weekends, actually, that figure was slightly higher, somewhere between 40 and 50% of what we would expect. And what that tells me and will tell you is that, in simple terms, the leisure market was picking back up a little bit quicker than commuters coming in from Bedford and St Albans and Harpenden and all the places on the line into London. And that's no great insight, but it's interesting, I suppose, to share those numbers with you. What we've seen, again, entirely as expected, is another drop down once the lockdown 2 was introduced a couple of weeks ago. And what that means is that, or what that means in practical numbers, is we're down back to around 20%. The thing that jumps out for me about that is that it's obviously a huge decrease on year, but it's a hell of a lot bigger than 5% during the previous lockdown. And there's a few reasons for that, but the most obvious ones are, one, the restrictions on whether you can leave the house and whether you can go into work are more nuanced. And also you've still got people going to school as well. And of course, a lot of people use our services to go to and from school. So that's where we've had, in terms of what that meant for the timetable. I'll be even quicker on this one. We, in a few stages, went right down to a 50% timetable, which is pretty much the lowest you can go without kind of shutting the railway in the depths of lockdown. It was brought back up a little bit more. We got to about 70%, 80%, and up to pretty much just not far off 90%. And that's what we're currently running. And we are not planning, or rather, we're not going to reduce our service for this lockdown. If we'd wanted to do it, we would have done it by now, because of course, famous last words, but this is a shorter period. And as I mentioned, the conditions are different. Looking forward on both of those things, passenger numbers and the timetable. We obviously will have a further timetable change in December. I'll come to that, I think, is maybe one of the next questions. But for us, the key is to make sure we run more than enough trains for our passengers as the demand grows. And we do anticipate, obviously, the demand growing into next year, particularly as we all hope the vaccine kicks in and government can start to reduce restrictions. And of course, social distancing, which is a thing none of us had ever heard of this time last year, but now seems to dominate our lives, can in due course be restricted and hopefully in due course removed, because that is a big kind of plus thing to us. It's not just how many people could fit on our train in normal circumstances, it's how many could fit given the need, ideally, to make sure people can maintain social distance of 1 meter plus. So we know some things about what's going to happen next, but I think we should all be honest that there are a lot of uncertainties about what will happen in the next few years, never mind the next 6 months. But I am hoping and anticipating and planning for a next 6 months, by which I mean pretty much 6 months from Christmas onwards, that we'll see, hopefully, the country get control of the virus. Hopefully restrictions begin to be eased. Obviously, we've got some big changes to the Midland Main Line due for May, and they're still very much on track. And throughout that, we need to make sure that we maintain as close to a full service as possible, while at the same time, and this is the important point, making sure that it is reliable. Because final point I'd make, as we reduced the service in April, we were pretty much just keeping a few days ahead of people going off and self-isolating and all that type of stuff. And obviously, Gary from Network Rail and Will would have had similar challenges. So as we go into the depths of winter, I've got already lots and lots of people who are self-isolating as a result of track and trace, or indeed have got COVID themselves. Balancing that, keeping them safe, making sure that they are off work and not under any pressure at all to come in, while making sure that we can staff our service and give you a reliable train service so that we don't face cancellations, is really, really important. And that's something that we are probably keeping the closest eye on of everything. The one thing I haven't mentioned in all of this is the contractual stuff, what you might have heard of as the EMA or the IRMA. I'm not going to talk about that now, but I suspect it may well come up as we get through this meeting. I'm very happy to answer some questions on it, and some I'll probably say, sorry, I can't talk about it because that's confidential, such is the nature of contracts. But Neil, that's probably enough from me just in terms of an overview. I just finished by saying that I just think the rail industry generally, and our staff in particular, have been magnificent throughout all of this. It's a huge undertaking simply to keep these things going, to keep our passengers able to get on trains, to keep our staff on side, our unions on side, our stakeholders like your good self. So the work and the attitude and the dedication our staff have shown so far gives me an enormous amount of, I'd say, pride, but also confidence and optimism that we have good times ahead. Thanks, Neil. That's it from me.
Thank you, Tom. That's appreciated. Perhaps I'll now go turn to Will. Will is the Managing Director of East Midlands Trains, and I'm going to ask him basically the same question, but to ask that he adds onto it a top-up of a talk about what's going to happen in May 21 with the arrival of the EMR electric services. So over to you, Will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil, and again, thank you for the opportunity to join the meeting today. It's my first one of these, so hopefully I'll pitch it about right. I'm joined by Andy Commons, who's my Head of External Communications Stakeholder Engagement, and also Laura Etheridge, who's our Stakeholder Manager, and I'm Will Rogers, Managing Director, East Midlands Railway. Very similar story to Tom in terms of the business impact. For us, it's been very profound. And on the 2nd of March, we set up a crisis command, and that continues to manage our response today. We've got a strategic vision to deliver safe and reliable journeys to support the nation. And over the course of the COVID period, we've delivered 5 timetable changes. So a similar story to Tom again, from the depths of lockdown, we had the key worker timetable when there was essential travel. We stepped up quite significantly for the summer holidays and for Skegness operation as well. Did a lot of strengthening out there because there was a significant staycation that occurred in the early part of the summer holidays. Then there was the return of schools, and we stepped up a little bit more, back up to about 97% of our traditional levels of service. And more recently, we have actually reduced our timetable slightly. So Tom was starting to talk about the balance of service level versus the resource base you have, and you'll probably be aware that the Midlands has been quite affected by COVID, and we're seeing quite significant absence within our organisation. So we actually, on the 26th of October, reduced the level of services we run slightly to provide that more resilient service. We've done things like put enhanced cleaning in place on our stations and on board, done all the social distancing information on trains and stations, and a couple of key milestones for us have been getting ticket checking and selling back on board the trains, and also first class catering is now operating on our trains as well. There's been we've embraced a lot of new ways of working, so similar to many organisations, and again, as you hear us talk when we start talking about passenger numbers, those new ways of working in terms of home working apply to our own management staff as well. I think it's fair to say there's been some good working and good support from local stakeholders and agencies. One I'd call out is working with the local resilience forums, particularly in response to the Leicester lockdown. That was a kind of quite a significant challenge in terms of how we responded to the first lockdown at Leicester. Again, work closely with those local agencies. And ultimately, I'm extremely proud of how the EMR team have responded to the pandemic. I started in my role on the 2nd of January, and 2 months later, we were in the world of COVID, and you really see what your team is made of, and really, really pleased and delighted with how everyone's responded to the challenge. Moving on to passenger volumes. So again, very similar story to the one that Tom described. Depths of the first lockdown, we were circa 2 to 3% of last year. We peaked about 30% in the last week of the school holiday. So there was steady growth as restrictions were eased up to the last week of the school holiday. As schools went back, we saw a slight dip, and that was leisure dropping off, because leisure drove a significant part of that increase. And then there's been a steady decline as additional restrictions have been put in place, settling down at about 20%. Then, of course, there's been the next national lockdown, and then there's been a further significant step down to about 12% last week. So that's the kind of the overall picture from a passenger perspective. In terms of passenger expectations, we've been doing a lot of work to engage with passengers, particularly sort of post-travel. Confidence to travel is the primary concern that we're picking up in the feedback we're getting, and priorities of our passengers have changed as well significantly. So things like train cleanliness, train reliability, and information before the journey are now top priorities. So that point about being confident in travel. Value for money is now a much lower priority. Now Neil asked me to pick up specifically on the May 21 timetable change. So this was the the December 20 timetable change, which has become the May 21 timetable change. And that's all because of the impact of the COVID pandemic on our ability to deliver that. So what we're going to be doing is creating two distinct service groups, the intercity and electric service groups. And that's a key principle of the franchise specification and is contracted in our train service requirement. We have listened to feedback from the consultation, and we're working to add some limited direct contra-peak services from Bedford and Wellingborough to Leicester and Nottingham in morning and evening commuter times. So that's one bit of listening we've done and some changes we're making from the original consultation. It's on track for delivery in May 21. Staff have been recruited and they're all trained. We've established a new train crew hub at Kettering. If you go through Kettering Station, you'll see some porter cabins, which is a temporary solution currently to the left of the entrance to the station as you come out of it, and that's where our train crew are now based. We're working on, just handover of the Kettering electric stabling is taking place as well, so that's now ready and we're taking over that. From an electrification perspective, I'm sure Gary will touch on this, but Network Rail have been done some sterling work to catch up on that programme, and we pulled in some significant disruptive access at the end of August when passenger volumes were low at the weekends to complete the works and energise the OLE. Testing and commissioning of that is now taking place. The first of the 360s are arriving on our network now, and there's one down at Cricklewood. And then driver training will start in earnest in the new year. We do plan to operate a limited number of Class 360 passenger services prior to the timetable change date. So in summary, May 21 is all on track. Hopefully that's a useful intro, Neil. Similarly, there's some other points we can reflect on later around things like IRMAs, EMAs, etc.
Thanks very much, Will. That's much appreciated. That is definitely appreciated. I'm going to move on now to Gary. Gary Walsh from Network Rail, and ask Gary his introductory question. And the question I've got for Gary really is to try and get an understanding of, what are the key initiatives you've got underway to improve reliability on the railway? And the classic example we had is there were a big set of signalling problems on the Saturday just gone in the St Albans area. What is causing these things, and how are you learning to try and reduce the frequency they occur and recover from them quicker? So over to you, Gary, and perhaps you can introduce the rest of your team on the call as well.
Okay, thanks, Neil, and good evening, everyone. I'm Gary Walsh. I'm the Route Director for Network Rail for East Midlands. Joining me on the call this evening is my Head of Comms, Rachel Lowe, who's going to make sure I keep on track, Neil, and don't say anything that I shouldn't. So, very briefly, I'll just do a bit of introduction where Network Rail are, and then I'll answer the question that you've asked. So, over the last 12 months, as you know, we've been running our Putting Passengers First programme, which has been around creating capability and devolving accountability of Network Rail to the routes. And that means that we've been able to step up our capability in East Midlands route. And the last phase of that went live in October. And what that meant is we have all of the levers necessary that we need to pull to improve the reliability and operation on East Midlands under the auspices of East Midlands. In simple terms, it means we've got the Infrastructure Directorate, so all the money in the schemes, all the funding in the schemes that we have in CP6 to improve our railway in our renewals plan now sits under the control of East Midlands rather than York. What that means, Neil, is that we can be more responsive to customer and passenger needs. So we can work with yourselves, GTR, EMR, cross-country and freight users to deliver the needs of the railway and be much more agile and fast-paced. So really that's the challenge that I expect Tom and Will and yourselves to hold us to account to over the next 12 months and beyond. Are we now able to respond to the emerging needs of the railway on the East Midlands? In terms of the specific question you asked around the reliability between Bedford and St Pancras, one of the first things that we've created is what's called the First 50 Miles plan, which both Tom and Will are very familiar with, and I'd like to extend the opportunity at a suitable time to take you through the plan in a bit more detail, because there's literally hundreds of line items in the plan. But basically what that intends to do is to reinforce the reliability and our operational response capability between Bedford and St Pancras before we get to the May 21 timetable. That is a multi-million pound plan, which covers all asset work streams. So it covers OLE, the core as a asset system itself, which I can talk about in a second, P-way, S&T, off track, and everything in between. One of the areas that we've been suffering from recently is 650 volt power system failures, which you've been experiencing as a loss of signalling. And we've had a number of quite major incidents, including the one at Harpenden North at the weekend. To be blunt, that's caused by failing 650 volt cable condition. The cables on the south of the patch between Bedford and St Pancras, Neil, are of a vintage of approximately 30 years old and are in much need of renewal. So as a first sort of signal of how our route is able to respond, I've authorised a £3 million programme to renew and improve our worst feeders, which are Harpenden North and South, Flitwick North and South, and Leagrave, prior to May 2021. So that work's ongoing, and including works at Christmas. But I say that's a real piece of work that we need to deal with, a real present threat to our reliability. Other works that we are doing, which will either indirectly or directly affect the reliability of the people on this call will see. We have installed axle counters in the core as secondary detection. And for those who've ever been through the core, it's a very porous tunnel, a very wet tunnel, and the track circuits in there can be affected by water ingress. So the axle counters remove that risk. We're also re-railing through the core. It's a very tight tunnel in terms of curvature, which can cause multiple defects. So we've now just, we're halfway through a £7 million programme of re-railing in the core. I won't go into too much detail because there's probably some further questions that you've also got, but I think you can see between Luton and Flitwick the amount of vegetation work that's been done, and we've now started the work south of Luton to deal with our major vegetation hotspots south of Luton. And again, we have done a huge amount of work with our OLE system to improve the capability of our OLE teams and also the resilience of that infrastructure. And I'm very pleased to see that our OLE is in the best condition in terms of hot weather preparation that we've ever seen, and that was evidenced through the summer, as it was with our rail condition. And I don't think we put a heat speed on there for either rail or OLE through the summer. And as you know, we did have, I know it's a long time ago, but we did have some very hot weather days. So I will leave it there. It's just to summarise that the reliability of the network, particularly south of Bedford, is acutely recognised by myself. Will and Tom hold Network Rail to account regularly on our programme to deliver the required improvements, and my team are committed to delivering the improvements we need to make May 21 a success.
Thanks very much, Gary, that's appreciated. I'm going to move now to Linda. Linda is from Transport Focus, so I'm going to ask Linda to give a quick chat about what Transport Focus is, her role in it, and in particular to talk about the work that they've done, quite a lot of work they've done on perceived and actual risks of travelling by train. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you very much, Neil, and absolutely delighted to be here this evening. So I'm Linda McCord from Transport Focus. I'm one of the senior stakeholder managers who take our insight out into the field to get improvements for transport users. So basically, since we started in COVID, Transport Focus has been carrying out a weekly survey of 2,000 interviews every week since really sort of the end of April, beginning of May. And then more recently, we've set up community of transport users across the country. 60 of those are relating to rail. So basically, what I want to sort of talk through a little bit is the difference between what people are saying who are travelling on rail and the perception of those who are not. And we've been gathering that data all this time. And really, I think the first point to make is to back up what Tom said earlier about the staff being great and the response by the railway to what has been an extremely challenging situation. And what we're seeing is that overall satisfaction with those who are actually using rail is really quite high. It's been at 80%, it's dipped just a little bit in the last few weeks. Feeling safe in respect to COVID and the measures that are being put in place is at 87%, so really is quite high. And then you have things like cleanliness, where the satisfaction is at 77%, people wearing face coverings 64%. Those two elements have dipped a little bit, but still, you know, it's showing that things are being done by the staff in the railway that are making those who are travelling feel actually that they are safe through COVID and that the cleanliness and other things are in place. Ability to keep safe distance, 71%. So there is more to be done, and I'm sure the operators in Network Rail would agree with that. But what this is showing is that actually the hard work that the industry has put in is actually paying off for those who are travelling. However, the perception by those who are not travelling, and I'm here talking about people who used to travel quite a lot by rail, is really that rail is not for them yet. So when we asked people in the last 7 days, why have you not travelled by rail? 50% of people said basically they had no reason to do so. 36% of people said that they used a car or a van instead, and 25% of people said that they didn't feel safe. So we've also, not surprisingly, seeing a huge increase in people who have actually opted to use their car or van. And for somebody who's been pushing for the last 10 years for people to kind of get out of their cars and use public transport, this is hard for those of us who love our industry to see, but it is the beast. It is what we have been facing. So what I want to then just quickly move on is that we have this intelligence from those 2,000 interviews each week that is showing us some of the shifts, the same as the operators mentioned. The patronage was at such a figure coming out of the first lockdown, has increased and now seen a dip again. We're seeing those changes. But what we really wanted to understand is what drives some of those perceptions or some of those reasons why people feel that rail is not for them yet. So one of the areas that we often do in Transport Focus on a regular basis is we ask people what are their top priorities for improvement. And again, I think Tom, or might have been Will, touched on this, that the priorities have always been around your value for money, punctuality, reliability. Now, that has not changed. People still are saying to us that those priorities are very important. However, the whole area of cleanliness has significantly increased, and there is a strong feeling amongst people that that standard should never cease, that actually what they're seeing now from the operators and others and the cleanliness is something that they want to see happening in the future. Just to try and understand that a little bit more, we asked what a sort of comparison to retail and restaurants, just to try and get a sense from people on the whole area of cleanliness and the safety, is how they compare that with some of other industries. And what they've said is that they feel that restaurants feel much more controllable than trains in terms of risk. And that's because they are felt to demonstrate their safety messages much more explicitly. So they can see staff cleaning tables, the social distancing, and offering disposable menus, for instance. Now, I'm not saying that that is not what the rail industry is doing. I think that there just needs to be maybe a bit more visibility, and then those who are using will sort of cascade and communicate that to others, that actually, yes, this is a very safe, clean environment. Passengers are willing to travel again, but will take much more explicit communication to convince people. Another area that we did a deep dive into was all around staff presence. So what people told us is that staff obviously play a central role to help passengers feel safe and secure on the train, but many passengers report seeing a skeleton crew at their local stations. They argue that basic functions like ticket inspection are falling by the wayside, and there's a strong sense that the ideal response to the pandemic would be to have more staff, not less. When it comes to future travel, the community expects the usage of rail to be significantly lessened, even post-COVID. That's a really interesting one. Working with some colleagues in the West Midlands, Transport for West Midlands did quite a big survey on what people were thinking about when we come out of all of this, and about 80% said that they feel they will be working more from home. And then another question asked, do you think your employer will make that happen? And that reduced significantly. So a lot of what we're hearing, we really don't know. I agree with Tom that actually we won't be seeing maybe 5 days a week into the office, but it remains to be seen what will actually happen. Many assumed that rail would operate in a stripped back fashion post-COVID, and that this should be, by implication, involve cheaper rail fares. That's interesting. And then flexible ticketing options like carnets were well liked and assumed to be a fundamental part of post-COVID rail system. And I do think people are expecting that there will be network cuts, and I think now is the greatest opportunity for us all to work together to ensure that we're not leaving particular parts of society without transport. And I am saying transport as opposed to just rail, because actually we are in a new time where we do need to consider that there are other options. So while, yes, of course, we want people to return to rail, but where any network changes are going to happen, there should consideration be given that if a rail offering or service has to be cut, is there a bus service that could fill part of that gap? And I think we're entering into a time where actually we do need to be really working collaboratively, not only together in the rail industry, but also in other parts of transport, because after all, it's all about moving people. And sometimes people want to move by rail, and other times by bus, and sometimes they want to get into their cars. And we should be making those sort of choices easy for people. And I'll just finish by a couple of things that we will be looking at in the future. So started looking at travel at Christmas. That's something actually that we'll probably be publishing next week. What are people thinking about that whole sort of Christmas travel? There's interesting around antisocial behaviour as opposed to any sort of safety or concerns around COVID itself. But we've seen 30% more concerned that because than before, because there are less people on the trains, less people at the stations. So this is just something that is beginning to surface a little bit. And then we're starting to ask people about use of rail when there is a vaccine in place, so that we can build some of that intelligence. And then, of course, we're very much in transport focused, really interested in the whole retail and what is going to be offered on ticketing and some of the flexible tickets that we know people are interested in. And then, of course, the informed traveller, so that people are able to plan their journeys, is extremely important as well. So Neil, that's a little bit, and everybody listening, about what Transport Focus has been up to. And just to summarise that, really two things. One, Tom's point about the rail staff have been great. I do think that is extremely important. But then just picking up one point from Will around giving people the confidence to travel. Those who are travelling are saying they feel safe in respect to COVID. We just need to convince those who are not that actually it is. Thank you.
Thank you to Tom, Will, Gary and Linda. That's much appreciated. I'm going to... Fairs definitely seems to be a distinct winner in this topic. So I'm going to hand over to Tom, and I'm going to ask Tom a series of questions about fairs, and then perhaps I'll ask you afterwards, Will, for an East Midlands Railway top-up. And I guess the first question, Tom, is what's happening to tackle fares for the part-time commuter, and in particular, specifically, what's happening about the Carnet product and developments in there. So perhaps you can give us some comments on that. That would be much appreciated.
Very happy to do that, and I'll give you a full and comprehensive response of where we've got to, or where the industry's got to, which I think should give you some reassurance. But one thing that actually I'm slightly frustrated about is that as an industry working with the government, we haven't made progress a bit quicker. So I suppose that's the headline for you. The thing it's worth just putting in context first is that, to be blunt, this is all the government's money, and that is really what's driving this at the moment. So GTR was always a different type of franchise. We didn't keep the revenue from our tickets, we got a management fee. Will had a different arrangement, but under the contracts that we've now got with the government, which are absolutely fantastic in the sense that it's an investment by government in the rail industry to ensure that we can run our service, and we have avoided some of the really quite significant and unpleasant decisions that, for example, the airline industry has had to make faced with a similar challenge. We have our costs covered by the government. None of this is secret. It's all out there in the public domain, and all revenue is kept by the government. So a decision on what we can do is something that I can advocate for, I can champion. I and Will and whoever else can say this is the best way to meet our customer needs, and this is what we need to do to encourage customers back on the railway. At the end of the day, and this is entirely fair and appropriate, it is for the government and the Treasury, which is currently subsidising rail, to make a decision based on what it thinks is appropriate. So I just put that as a bit of context. To cut to the chase in terms of where we are, Carnet, and I'll choose my words carefully because, as you mentioned, Neil, I think this is being recorded, but watch this space. I'm very confident that we will have some good news to share around Carnet, and specifically Carnet going onto our key card in the very near future, and hopefully this side of Christmas, so in the next month or so. It's something I've been really pushing because insofar as something that does give people a discount on a slightly more flexible format, not having to sign up for a full season ticket, it's something that is popular. It's kind of unique to TL. There's a Thameslink and Great Northern. So being able to do that, and obviously being able to do that in a secure, contactless way, which is a big demand from my customers at the moment, I think would be a big win and a big step forward. As I said, I can't guarantee or unveil that today, but I am very confident, and I will certainly be coming back to you, as I said, hopefully in the next few weeks or month or so to update on that. In terms of the broader question, which is the question being asked by everyone in the country, which is basically, if people aren't going to be coming into work for 5 days a week, is there going to be some kind of semi-season ticket offered that means it's still good value if you come in 2 or 3 days a week? To put it in simple language, that goes back to my first comment about the context of the government and the Treasury and the money that would be involved. So from a pure customer perspective, I would like to see that happen, because of course it meets the customer demand. We know from speaking to our customers that some of them say actually having to fork out for a season ticket is one of the disincentives to get back on the train. Completely get that, but at the same time the financial consequences of that could be quite significant. There's a trade-off which you can't fully model, which is, roughly speaking, if you do that, would it encourage more people to come back than keeping it the same would disincentivize people to come back? And that's what is currently being worked through. And what I would say, and I'm very happy to say this to anyone, is that I think fares reform and making it more customer friendly, making it simpler, and certainly making it more flexible is something we at GTR have wanted for a long time, and I don't think there will ever be a better chance to do it than now. That's a, to be honest, a slightly a slightly vaguer answer to that broad point, because as I said, I don't think anyone in the country can give you a more specific answer at the moment, but hopefully a pretty clear steer on the carnet, where I am expecting positive news very shortly.
And will you have good news for people from places like Flitwick and Harlington that don't have the carnet at the moment?
That one I'm not so sure on, to be honest. So we are, as the phrase goes, in ongoing discussions with the DFT. And as I said, I will I'll definitely give you an update in this side of Christmas, and hopefully it'll answer all that. Well, certainly answer all those questions. But those are some of the, that's one of the other things that we're working through with the Department of Transport. Sorry, I should avoid acronyms.
Thank you, Tom. And I'm going to perhaps ask Will for his perspective on this, as somebody who's perhaps got an operator where it's less season ticket sales are still important, but perhaps less important than they are to Tom or the regular traveller.
Thank you, Neil. So building on what Tom said, in terms of just the contractual structure, prior to COVID, we took all revenue risk and all cost risk. And again, just similar to GTR, we're now in a place where all revenue risk vests with the Department for Transport, as well as all cost risk as well. So we're in the same place around flexible season tickets, in that being a decision that we're advocating, but is with the department. But one thing I would say that we are looking at, we're looking to see if we can develop some trials around demand-led pricing, particularly on our new electric services from Corby. So that's an area that we are actively focusing on right now in terms of developing some trials when that service group gets introduced from May next year. I think the conditions are right for reform and fares reform, particularly while all revenue vests with the Department for Transport. And the way I sort of simply articulate it is there's a pie of revenue, and it's how you divide it up. And whilst it's all in one place, that's got to be a great opportunity to look at how we carve it up and how we do simplify those fare structures. And I think it's going to be key to the return of passengers to rail as we look forward, and the recovery, to understand what future demand patterns look like and how we can respond to them. And I think some of this is going to be an evolving story as we understand what those patterns look like, what are the right products, but the need for more flexibility and the need to respect that it's very unlikely to be a return to 5-day week commuting is the kind of area we need to be focusing on.
In particular, I've just had a question: what is demand-led pricing?
Demand-led pricing. So if you've got a really busy train, it gets a little bit more expensive. If you've got a very lightly loaded train, you make a more attractive price so you attract people onto the more lightly loaded trains. So you use your capacity more effectively.
So the Ryanair model.
That kind of thinking, yes.
Yeah, so when will you start charging us for seats then? And toilets and whatever else Michael and Liam
and luggage
might want to charge us for?
Not going that far, but I think there is a point here that while we don't know what travel patterns are going to look like in the future quite yet, and we need to be able to respond to that. And one of the things one of the challenges for the railway has been peak travel and the capacity to deliver peak travel, which is not necessarily an efficient thing to deliver. And whilst travel patterns are changing to a new normal, there's got to be an opportunity to use our capacity more effectively.
Neil, could I just add to that, if I may? Because I'm talking again in generalities here, but I started off in answer to your first question talking about the number of passengers that have been coming, the kind of the headline percentages, but obviously there's huge amounts of intricacy within that. And one, I'm going to draw a graph with my hand, which may or may not work, but typically you would see our demand would go up, there'd be a peak in the morning, and then up again, it would be a peak in the evening. No great surprise there. What we've seen as customers come back, one is that the peak's actually a bit earlier. It's kind of more like 6 till 8 rather than kind of 7 till 9. But it's just much less pronounced. So in fact, what that is telling us, which is no great surprise, is that your classic commuter coming into the city, or London generally, to work and needs to be at their desk by 9 at the latest, they are exactly the type of jobs that are currently working from home. And quite how many of those people come back to work at all, stroke every day, is, I think, one of the points Will was mentioning. We just don't know, and we just don't know when. There are various models that I've seen that, you know, look reasonably convincing, but I'm not sure any of them is necessarily any more reliable than the other. And that is a really big opportunity, because I think, again, as Will said, in order to bring in, you know, safely, hopefully in some degree of comfort, people in and out of London for us in those peak times, we spend a lot of money transporting fresh air around off peak, because those trains are there, you've got to use them, and up and down they go. So that's one of the, again, I think, the most interesting and exciting questions we've got as an industry. But what we'll do, what we need to make sure we do, is actually do that based on what customers actually want, because, you know, one of the big things that I think Linda would hopefully kind of nod about is that the surveys I've seen from Transport Focus and our own surveys, a lot of them are about how can I avoid the peak. One of the things I'm most maybe nervous about is getting on a train that might be quite busy. How do we as GTR talk to various employers and go, okay, you can work with us and stagger some of the times that you would expect your employees to be in, and how can we work with you on the timetable? Again, fascinating topics, but they would all potentially have an impact on you know, the profile of when trains are being run, and I suppose, to Will's point, potentially the pricing.
I know Linda wants to make a quick point, so I'll ask Linda to make a quick point, and I think I'm going to move on from fares, otherwise we'll spend the next 45 years, I was to say 45 minutes, but it could be the 45 years talking about it. So I'll just ask Linda to make a quick comment, and then I'm going to move on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about come back to that briefly, Will, to the May 20 timetable. 21 timetable.
Okay, thank you, Neil. It's kind of a question really to Will and Tom. So Transport Focus will obviously be asking passengers, what is it that will entice them back to the railway? What is it that they want, in particular in respect to fares, to make them feel that, yes, I will certainly consider getting out of my car or whatever. So is this something within the sort of agreements that you have with the department, that you have a marketing or budgets that allow you to be asking that same question of people, so that you can convince not so much even the department but the Treasury that actually doing some of this more flexible ticketing is what's going to bring more revenue actually in the longer term?
Oh, if I just answer that one, Linda, and then obviously kind of, you know, address my response to the group as a whole. So as you know, Linda, you know, I've got colleagues in my team who do a lot of that kind of customer insight and talk to our customers. And Linda, you know, you sit on our customer board, don't you? That I chair, and I think next one's on Friday. So we do a lot of work to try and understand what our customers want, what annoys them, what their hopes and fears might be, and we use that along with you to make the case for whatever we think is in customers' best interests. To us, I don't actually think the challenge is convincing anyone that that's what customers want. I think it's a much more pragmatic pounds and pence argument about the affordability and making sure that could be something that could be agreed. And as I said, I cannot emphasize enough what a great supporter of the rail industry government has been throughout this pandemic. But you know, there is not a money tree in Rishi Sunak's garden, much as we might all hope that there is, and we are no different to any other industry or anything that is relying on government or public funding in that respect.
Thanks everybody on that. So I'm going to bring it to an end on fares, otherwise we'll be at it forever. And I was going to come back because it did come top of my poll, Will, was just to get you to say a little bit more about how confident you are. I guess two things: how confident you are that the May 21 timetable, and that's, apologies, I realised I went May 20 in my question. How confident you are that the May 21 timetable change will happen as scheduled is I guess the key thing. And I'll come back to you again, Tom, and ask you about some consequential changes for Thameslink. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Neil. So in terms of how confident am I that May 21 is going to take place as planned, I am confident that is going to take place as planned. There's a significant programme of activity that's underway to deliver it, and those key activities are on track. Now, what I would say is that there's a there's good cross-industry governance as well that's happening. So there's a program board that sits that has GTR on it, cross-country, Network Rail, and some other operators, and we're working collectively to track the program, and it does remain on track. Now, key things for me that are important are seeing things like trains coming onto the network. We've got the resources in place to enable this to happen, and from a Network Rail perspective, the infrastructure testing is coming on well. Now, the one thing that worries me is around the impact of COVID and the potential resourcing impact thereof. So today in my organisation, there's over 200 people who are absent due to self-isolation, being clinically extremely vulnerable, etc. We're still continuing to deliver driver training today to the beat rates that we expect to deliver driver training, but that's the kind of thing that is a risk to me, that we are really actively managing and seeking to get as much done as early as we can do, but as we are today, it is on track, and I'm confident we will deliver that. The point about the cross-industry piece is that this is the timetable changes. It's a sequencing across a number of different operators, and it enables changes for other operators as well. So hence there's the joint industry effort that involves multiple parties. And I think it's fair to say, in terms of a program, it's been quite successful in that respect, in terms of how early we've engaged on this and worked together to develop a timetable that does work and has been thoroughly tested before it gets enacted.
And Tom, what does that mean for Thameslink, the May 21 timetable? In particular, is the delightful subject of the Thameslink Expresses.
Yes.
What is their future?
So I will. I'll give you an answer on that one. But also, I'd suggest that, let's give him a bit of warning. It'd be good to bring Gary in on this question, because another key dependency is the infrastructure and the various works, which, again, I know from being on that same program board is a very reassuring answer. But I think it would be useful to hear him say it.
We'll go to Gary next then.
Thank you. So in terms of what it means, as Will mentioned, Thameslink any change to Thameslink are dependent on, the East Mids timetable, and I think most people on this call will be familiar with the history of that. So we are very much ready, waiting, and planning on making those changes, because that's what we said we'll do. And not the only thing stopping us, but the requirement to do things at the same time as a cross-industry approach is the reason why December became May 21. And therefore that is when those things will happen. In terms of the Thameslink Express, as you call it, which was Bedford, Luton, and St Albans and straight into London, short answer is no, but not far off, actually. So actually in December we are introducing some more services, and the key thing is that will stop at Bedford, Luton, and St Albans. It'll also stop at Flitwick and Harpenden, so that's what makes it a 50-minute service rather than that one that was a little bit shorter. But if you think that our slower services are anywhere between 62 and 67, 68 minutes, then it is a significant difference.
Yeah, so over to you in that case, Gary, for some views on all of this from the Network Rail perspective. How ready are you for the May 21 changes?
Thanks, Neil. So I think in summary, we're in a good position of readiness. I think, as Will alluded to, the majority of the infrastructure interventions are now complete. The OLE is up. The dynamic testing is on programme, and we're regularly increasing the speed of that dynamic testing up to line speed. Fourth lines through Sharnbrook's complete. Kettering Electric Stabling is completed, now handed over to EMR. So I think in terms of infrastructure readiness, we are very confident that that the infrastructure will be ready to support the May 21 timetable. I think, just building on what Will and Tom said, though, there is obviously painful experiences from previous timetable uplifts. They go back to 2018. And I think if you look at the governance of the May 21 or December 20 moving to May 21 timetable, there's from a personal point of view, a greater level of assurance, and I think quality in the governance and assurance that all parties are going to be ready. subject to the risk again that Will referred to in terms of COVID. If we can just put that into reality, today we're dealing with a 50% absence of signallers in the East Midlands Control Centre. Now that doesn't affect yourself and commuters and passengers south of Bedford, but that situation has moved from effectively a 0 absence a week ago to, as I say, half our signallers off. So the COVID risk at the moment is very real and very volatile. And as Will said, you know, that is a risk that we're all just still trying to manage in a very, very live environment. Beyond the sort of COVID risk and the infrastructure enhancements that I talked about, there is then the piece of work that my team are trying to do, which is to make the existing infrastructure as reliable as possible, which is the stuff I talked about in my introduction. I think the last thing from me is, whilst I think I'm confident, or have more confidence in our assurance around our readiness as an industry for May 21, I think what we need to do between now and May is provide some external assurance, some independent assurance, to make sure that we're not showing optimism bias in our readiness. So we're going to get colleagues from Western, who did the GWEP introduction, to come and test our assurance and test our plans to make sure that we are not being overly optimistic in our readiness assessments.
Thank you, Arthur. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, to the subject of the EMR timetable in 21?
Not a great deal. The main thing certainly is from the Bedford members is the reintroduction of the peak trains at Bedford, and obviously also at Luton, and hopefully this will happen from May. But one of the questions that has been raised to me is on the Class 360s, in the sense that are you confident that you're going to have enough 360s over for May, bearing in mind that as far as I understand it at the present time, the Class 720s at Greater Anglia are still not in service, and also a spec for the refurbishment of them, so that we can actually have some input and into that decision for the refurbishment.
That's a good question, Arthur. So in terms of the 360s, I think what you've you articulated quite clearly is the complexities of the rolling stock market in the UK and how there's cascades from different operators. Where we are is we're confident we're going to have sufficient trains to operate the service, and the first of those trains came across this week and is down in Cricklewood. So that there's a cascade plan that works to get available trains. The key thing we need is sufficient trains, just in readiness to start driver training early in the new year, and we're confident that that's all on track. And then there's a cascade plan that works thereafter. You're correct that the delayed Aventra programme has been a challenge, but those new train rollouts are now happening more successfully, and some of the challenges of the Aventra product platform have been solved. So I think I read the other day that Arriva Rail London have just completed their rollout of Aventra, and the ones for Anglia, the next one's off the block. So that's moving in the right direction now as well. In terms of the specification, that's quite a live discussion in terms of developing the specification for that refurbishment, and I'll certainly we'll look for opportunities to engage on that, I think, Arthur.
Yeah, I mean, if I just come back, one other point is, obviously you're probably aware that the loss of intercity services has not gone down very well at all in Bedford, and I'll take on board what you said earlier about introduction as a result of the consultation of some contra-peak intercity calls, but would you consider actually reviewing the whole concept, if you will, that we should continue stopping intercity trains at at both Luton and Bedford, because people do actually travel north. They don't all go to London, and this change of the loss of in-city services is going to cause a certain amount of problems, and on top of that, you'd have to change trains at Kettering, which won't be same platform. That means you've got to get off one train and go across to another platform, which it obviously is going to increase the likelihood of people might think, well, is it me worth going on the train? I might stay and go in my car.
So yeah, good question again, Arthur. So the concept of separating the intercity and the electric service groups was an integral part of the specification of the franchise, as specified by the department, and I don't see that changing materially, and this is the culmination of developing a timetable that fits the needs of many different stakeholders, and there is always going to be a trade-off in that. But I genuinely understand the concern. What we've done around contra-peak is what we can reasonably do within the timetable, because there is finite space. So we've made some steps, recognizing that there is some market, albeit small. So we have tried to provide something, but I don't see the fundamental principle of the timetable changing at all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to change topics a bit now and go to Tom. Certainly as a stakeholder, Arthur and I have heard a lot about the trade-off between cutting the service back slightly for the increase in the expected, well, we know actually not to be the known increase we get back out of it in terms of reliability and lower cancellation rates. So I think it would be useful if you could say a few words more generally, because this sort of topic of the trade-off hasn't probably made its way out into the public a lot. And also as a variation of that, there's the question of pressure coming out of the government apparently for you to cut back services to save money.
Yes. Okay. So I think they're two very different points, although maybe they come back to the same topic. So that trade-off, and I'll just kind of almost start with kind of timetable 101. So if there's a really depressing graph, which people in the industry are now familiar with, will have seen it before, and it just plots amount of trains on the railway every day with performance, i.e. how many trains are kind of cancelled or delayed over the last 5 years. And it's just a straight graph. It's just a straight correlation down. You cram more and more trains on and the performance gets worse. And what I think there's been a collective realization of is that in a really big push by everyone, we're not distancing ourselves from being part of that, to get more and more capacity onto the railway in response to people saying, even with that increase, I still can't get a seat, or, I find it hard to book a ticket. That has come at a cost, and that did come at a cost. And actually the performance of the railway in the few periods before COVID hit were pretty poor, to be honest. And that wasn't unusual. All the work that we talked to you about, all the frustrations that people have, were, I think, entirely justified and something we were very well aware of. What we saw once lockdown hit, is, I suppose unsurprisingly, is, and I'm quoting Grant Shapps here to the select committee rather than my own view, if you get rid of those pesky customers and quite a few of the trains, funnily enough, performance increases. So when we were running half of the trains, 50%, and obviously there were even fewer than that customers, our performance rates were stratospherically high. The PPM within 5 minutes were in the high 90s. Now on time measure, so to the minute, wasn't far off that, and that's compared to an industry average over the last few years of somewhere around low 70s for on time and maybe high 80s, low 90s if you're lucky for performance. Obviously we would like to see those much higher. I set myself and my team the task of having a PPM measure that's in the 90s and an on time that's in the 80s as well. So where is the sweet spot? At what level do you get compared to 100% previously, where to add more trains in would actually be net? It wouldn't be a good idea, in short, because you're setting the service up to fail, either because you haven't got enough turnaround time for trains, or there are certain trains that are consistently late and, as to use a term, pollute the rest of the industry, particularly given on a network like Thameslink, any delay going through that core from St Pancras down south of London Bridge has the potential to delay pretty much every other train on our entire network, directly or indirectly. Exactly what that sweet spot is will depend on what part of the country you're in, what type of services you're running, and actually, if you improve the infrastructure, if you had really good management on every aspect of it, the number would go higher. But I think there's a general view around the industry that somewhere around kind of 90%, maybe a bit higher than that, is probably the optimum for making sure you should be able to deliver really good reliability. Now, I need to emphasize and stress that is not the same as the industry saying, and that's what we're going to do in the future, and we wouldn't go any higher than that, because that's not how these things work. What I would say is at the moment, that's pretty much what the industry is delivering in terms of level, how many trains are being run at the moment. That's largely, or certainly partly, a consequence of simply how our resources, how many people we've got to drive trains and operate signals and all the other things that Will and Gary mentioned. But it is also obviously an opportunity for us to see what that means in terms of performance. And performance, the occasional infrastructure problem put to one side, has actually been very good over the last year. It's been by a long way the best year we've had in living memory, but I'm well aware that the circumstances have been exceptional, so you can't do a year-on-year like-for-like comparison. To answer your question about, and just to answer it directly, because I think it deserves a direct answer, but you'll forgive me if I don't, I can't answer all of it. You know, you obviously read the same papers as me. I think it was the Times that had a story. Is the Treasury demanding cuts and all that type of stuff? I go back to my earlier point. You know, the rail industry is being subsidised hugely by the government, and clearly that amount of subsidy can't go on forever. As Will mentioned, and I mentioned as well, every single penny of all our costs is being met by government, and therefore I suppose it's entirely sensible, natural, and to be expected for them to ask us, how do we manage those costs effectively, while at the same time making sure that we can run a good, reliable service that is more than sufficient for the amount of passengers that we've got. Beyond that, to be honest, it's speculation. What I would say is that we've already got our December timetable in NRES, and people can see that, and actually we're adding a few services in terms of what happens next year. I'd refer the learned gentleman to a lot of the other answers. Is that there are so many uncertainties in this country, in the world at the moment, in terms of what COVID will mean for society, for government finances, for the rail industry, and for commuter patterns, that to be honest, it's just another factor that will almost certainly play into that. So as I said, that is not a here you go, the answer is 4.6, and I think you'd probably understand why I couldn't do that, but hopefully it's a relatively honest answer, and hopefully it also explains that point around the infamous sweet spot between numbers of trains and getting the most reliable service.
Thank you. Can I stay with you just briefly? And we'll then go on to Will next. How much authority do you have to make decisions at the moment, and what sort of things can you decide to do versus has to go off to the Department for Transport and the Treasury for approval?
Yeah, so I see Will is there's maybe a slight smile from Will. Being completely honest, there were quite a few things that we would have had to ask the government in our previous franchise. So when a company, a private company as we are, and as EMR or EMT is, when we agree a franchise, actually loads of things are set up front. So everything from how long the ticket offices are open, to how many trains are run, to how many stakeholder conferences we run. That's something we agree, we sign up to willingly, and then to change that without approval is to breach a contract. So it's no different to any other company that has a quite large and complex. So contract management, which is a really boring phrase, is effectively what you're doing day to day, regardless of whether there's COVID or not. So my authority or autonomy, whatever you want to call it, to do loads of things within that contract is absolute. But if it's anything that would change what we've promised to deliver, for example, the timetable, or shutting ticket offices, or sorry, as an example, not saying we're planning on doing that, then that is something we would need to ask the department for their approval, because they would say something along the lines of, wait a second, we're still paying you the same amount of money, yet you're doing less. How does that work? We need to understand what the justification for that would be, because they are there to safeguard the interests of the public person and also customers. What I would say is that actually it's been a, dare I say it, surprisingly pleasant process. So working with the Department for Transport, they have not lived down to the civil service stereotype of being very slow in making decisions and meaning we can't do what we need to do. I need to make lots of decisions every day. My team needs to make lots of decisions every day. Lots of them, there is a grown-up understanding that the Department for Transport shouldn't and couldn't be involved in. If they're slightly more substantial decisions, and for the record, timetable changes will be one of those, then we have the right discussion. We go through things, they ask intelligent questions, and we'll come to a sensible decision, which more often than not is what we suggest to them. But they have the authority to take the final call on big things like that. And again, I don't think that's probably a surprise to anyone. It's certainly not a secret in terms of the current contractual arrangement. If Will's about to tell me he's got some great deal I'm not aware of, then I'm about to get jealous. But that's the kind of overview of how we work these things.
Over to you, Will, because it must have been a bigger change for you, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, it has been, yes, and sorry, Tom, I'm not going to disappoint you with a big surprise. So earlier on, I used the term TSR, which is train service requirement, quite deliberately, and TSR is what you're contracted to deliver, and any change to your TSR is a change to a contractual deliverable that you have to agree with the Department for Transport. So all of those things exist today as they did before. We've been making some changes to our TSRs, because you'll have heard the build back better sort of phraseology and looking for opportunities. And what Tom was articulating when we described the sweet spot is how we build back a better railway that performs more highly, and we've made some changes there where we've sought the agreement from the department to make those changes, particularly in areas like our Liverpool to Norwich route, which is one of our challenging service groups, and also between Derby and Crewe. So less relevant for this meeting, but it's the same kind of principle. Then there's another couple of other points to sort of just talk about in terms of our relationship with the department. With revenue sitting with the department, it means that there are some, there's additional decisions that go via the department when it comes to things that affect revenue, and also the term of our agreements is different to what it was before. So that means where you're entering into things like contracts that extend beyond the franchise term, you need to involve the Transport Authority in that as well, because that's a long-term decision for the industry. So there's closer engagement there, and I think the final point I would make is that I think all of our relationships with the department have changed, and the point on cost and risk that we've been quite clear about is consistent across operators, and therefore it's important that the Department for Transport are consistent and fair. So there are things that we do put via them to make sure that we have a consistent industry response. And when we look at the pandemic as a whole, I think it's been a challenge throughout our response to the pandemic, but also something that we've done pretty well, I think, in terms of delivering a consistent response. And that's been through a blend of things. It's been working with the Department for Transport to provide that consistency in decision making, but also through other industry bodies such as the RDG, and I mean, Tom and I are probably bored to the sight of each other, the amount of different Teams calls we've been on together, working through collectively what that common industry response is, because that's been really important. The final point I would make is that day to day we run the railway, and I made reference to the command structure that I put in place at the start of the pandemic, and through that I devolved a lot of decision making to my senior leadership team, and that strategic command structure, and I see that as key to our successful response, has been able to devolve that kind of responsibility, and we are still, we have that devolved responsibility and the accountability to deliver. Neil, you're on mute. You're still on mute, Neil.
stand up. Yeah. I'm going to ask Linda to, you're on mute, the phrase of 2020. So ask Linda.
I'm regularly guilty of this now.
For a few concluding words on these two topics.
I suppose, really, I think Tom will, others have covered it, but it's something that I mentioned right at the beginning about another buzz kind of word around collaboration, and certainly something that's very much part of any new contracts. Is that we just do need to be working very much together, and also just not to forget that rail is not seen in isolation, that there are other modes that we just need to be aware of and ensure that we're working together on. So just a brief point. I think it's been well covered.
Thank you. I'm going to move on for the last 14 minutes. I've got different. So eventually we're going to get out of this pandemic, whenever that might be, and I don't need you to speculate on when that might be. But when we do, how are we going to go about encouraging people to get back to the train? And I'm going to start by asking Linda for a few words on that, and then we'll go around to Tom. And I'll also be interested, obviously, get a view in that section, get a view from Gary as well, just from the infrastructure point of view. So perhaps Linda, you can start us off with just a few words, and then we'll go to Tom, and we'll finish off with Gary, and then I think we might be done.
Okay, so I think I've covered some of this in the work that Transport Focus has done, and of course Tom mentioned, I'm sure it's the same with Will, that we ask people what is it that will make them make that decision to come back to rail. Last year, before all of this, Transport Focus embarked on something called Give Bus a Go, to entice and encourage people to start using buses more. And it was hugely successful in that we got a group of people actually who had very rarely used bus. We call them the busketeers, to give bus a go, and it really had a good impact. And we were going to revisit that, but actually Transport Focus now will be looking on how we can work with the industry to encourage people to give public transport a go, come back. And we will want to be seeing all those things that people are telling us are the priorities, including flexible fares and all the stuff that Tom will have touched on in making sure that the reliability, right time railway, the opportunity to make sure that we have timetables that actually work. All of those things will be important, but I think the big thing is working in collaboration to ensure that we're delivering and asking people what it is that they want.
Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm not going to speculate, although I have to say I'm feeling quite a bit more optimistic this week than I was, whenever it was the day before we had the first of those two announcements about a vaccine, because that does feel like the first good news we've had for some time. So fingers crossed on that one. I think it's probably worth starting with, what has not changed. So the essentials of what any of our customers, passengers, want from a railway is basically still the same. Just there are some additional bits as well. So they want a nice, clean train. They want a reliable service. They want a regular service. They want a station that is welcoming, safe, and has what they need. Hopefully, it's got a nice coffee shop there and things like that. And they'd like helpful and friendly staff. They also these days would want to apply all of those adjectives to our website, Twitter, or all that type of stuff. So those what we call the brilliant basics haven't changed, and we need to make sure we deliver all of those. I think the two big things that have come out, when you say research, but just reading the papers, talking to customers, talking to lots of people, overwhelmingly for me, one is the fares point, which we've already talked about, so I won't dwell on that one, but that's, I think, one of our biggest challenges. The other one, which I am directly in control of, and then I think, therefore, I can probably be a bit more confident that we will continue to do this, is there is a huge premium put on trains being clean, and specifically COVID secure clean. So there is a huge amount of work that we've done through our cleaning teams, through our station teams. A lot of time and money has gone into making sure that every single train, every single part of every train, every station, every waiting room is sprayed with a special bacterial disinfectant that kills COVID dead for 28 days, and that's reapplied every 21 days. We have extra cleaners on our trains. We have hand sanitizers at our stations. We have one-way station plans so that we're looking to minimize the chance of people having to bump into each other. We have a new app on our website which tells you which trains are going to be more or less busy. The list goes on. All of these things have specifically been in response to COVID, and they're all specifically to address the question of, to be frank, I'm scared to get on a train. I'm worried that in getting on a train, I'm taking an unnecessary risk. The one thing I haven't mentioned, but I think is probably the most high profile, is the topic that can be summarized in one word, and that's masks. So we have just actually completed a trial with the BTP, British Transport Police, to get more people wearing masks. We see compliance of about 90 to 95%, which, given some people can't wear them, is not far off, total. However, I'm under no illusions, there is a certain hardcore of, to be frank, rude antisocial people who don't bother, and they also don't bother to do other things as well on our trains. And also, we saw this earlier in the pandemic, to use simple language, people who've had a few are less likely to comply with wearing a mask. Some of our later night services, some of our weekend services, our leisure travellers were not complying, and that, to be frank, that's selfish, because you may have people on that train who are very nervous, who are vulnerable themselves. So the more we can do, and we are doing a lot to encourage people to wear them, to support the BTP in enforcing it, to enable all those type of things, that's something that's going to continue to be a big focus for us, because it's a very high profile and visible way of showing people that you can travel with confidence, you can travel safely, not just because we've got a nice reliable train service, but because we've gone to the the ends of the earth to make sure that our trains are secure. And the final point, there was actually a story in the Standard yesterday, which some of you may have seen, which was making this exact point. There have been various independent tests swabbing different trains, and GTR was the latest to be done yesterday, and that did prove, for what it's worth, that there was no COVID found on our trains because of all the work that has been done. So fares reform, reliability, and making sure our trains are clean and safe and welcoming. That's it from me. Thanks, Neil.
Excellent. Will, over to you.
Thank you, Neil. Really build on Tom's point. I think there's a couple of things. It's going to require the whole industry to work together to develop and provide services which are aligned to changes in passenger behaviour, and then to market them appropriately. I mean, today, limited marketing has been around sort of campaigns of confidence, and to reassure passengers that the railway is safe. Again, in there's things like fares reform is going to be a key element as we look to grow back, and also is providing a welcoming and safe environment. We're being quite consistent in terms of the kind of activities that we are undertaking to provide that clean and consistently clean environment, and I think that's going to be ever present as we move forward, to provide that reassurance and confidence to travel.
Okay, thank you. And Gary, do you have anything to add, particularly sort of from the infrastructure perspective?
Yeah, I'll be brief. So I think my role is for the infrastructure to be boringly predictable. The words from Steve White, who you all know as Chief Operating Officer at GTR, and continue to ring in my ears, that passenger tolerance to disruption has evaporated. And that's something I talk to my team regularly about. So we need to be boringly predictable. We need to have extremely high levels of reliability. And if it does go wrong, be crystal clear in our plans to reinstate the network or fix the fault in simple terms, and have great communication with the likes of Tom's team and Will's team, so they can inform the passengers and everybody's clear on how we are doing, and then can plan accordingly. I think when we do have disruption, when we do have infrastructure failures, that's put pressure on the system, and especially around what Tom was saying in terms of passenger nervousness. When we have disruption, that can create crowding on stations, can create crowding on trains. So the ripple effect in terms of passenger confidence on the railway is marked. So I think like I say, my aim is to be boringly predictable. I think the last thing I just want to say, Neil, is we are seeing a significant increase in trespass, vandalism and suicidal activity on the East Midlands. I was speaking to one of our embedded BT inspectors a couple of weeks ago, and in the last month we've moved from a unfortunately, it's a terrible statistic, but a fatality or attempted fatality, 1 in 49 days to about 1 in 7 days, and we've had one today at Leicester, and that is something that, you know, is a very, very complex societal issue, and that's something that we are in the midst of trying to manage now, and will, I think, be with us for certainly a number of months.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just finish off with a couple of quick fire questions, some of which have come from the from the chat. And the first one is to Tom, and that is the question: is what is the latest on Class 700s and Wi-Fi and drop-down tables?
Okay, yeah, good question. The latest is we've not actually seen any significant difference in the situation. Now, I'm well aware that we've got Wi-Fi on some trains, but not all of them. And drop-down tables is something that, you know, we did want to put in, but we haven't been able to yet. So no news, I'm afraid, on that one. It is something that we are continuing to pursue, but I can't give a nice, happy answer on that one, I'm afraid. But at least it's an answer for you.
And on the same subject, a question for Will: will the Class 360s have Wi-Fi?
Will the Class 3? I'm actually going to defer that question to Andy Commons, who's on the line.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, evening, everyone. Yes, they will. They already do, and we will be keeping it.
Thank you. Now, a quick fire question for Gary, which is: can Network Rail Kent and South East make an awful lot of use of Twitter, and they have a Twitter feed that's really quite loquacious at times. It goes off and, you know, gives very good explanation often of the causes of the various delays and what their teams, and indeed what the industry as a whole, is up to fix it. Have you got any plans to do anything similar for East Midlands?
So a bit like Will, I will defer to my brand new head of communications, Rachel, who's hopefully on the line with us. Rachel, can you talk to us about what our plans are for use of Twitter, please?
Thanks, Gary. So yeah, brand new as in literally week 4, I think. So what I'm very keen to do is to take the best of what's happening everywhere. So certainly we will learn what we can from the Kent and Sussex fees. They are a significant operation, so we will have to cut that cloth accordingly. And what I don't want to do is to duplicate what's already being done well on our train operating colleagues' feeds. So we will be doing something. It's definitely a work in progress, but it needs a bit more scoping out and thought so that it's a meaningful and useful tool rather than tick box exercise.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and indeed at that point, thank you to everybody who's come along. It's been much appreciated that you've come.
Can I say something, Neil? It's to all of them. A thank you to all the railway staff who have, over the last 8-9 months, have continued to operate the train service that people can use, either leisure or key workers. But it's a big thank you to all the railway staff.
Thanks, Arthur. That's really kind of you. Thank you.
Yes, so Arthur, not just to all the railway staff, but specifically to the railway staff that have, and Linda, who have pitched up tonight and given up their evening for us. That it really is most appreciated that you've done that, and thank you for that. Whether we will be meeting again like this on Zoom in 12 months' time, or we'll be back to our traditional meet in person in a church hall somewhere, is yet to be determined. And actually, we'll ask a question about that. So in terms of what's going to happen next for everybody on this call, we have recorded it and we will circulate that recording location. I'll also circulate to people all the various chat And between us, Arthur and the questions and answers, and between us, Arthur and I will perhaps work out some questions that will go back to all our people to collect any answers that we haven't got. And they also answered some questions for us that we knew already we wouldn't have time for. So we will be in contact with that. And if you're on this call and you don't get either the APTU or the BCA newsletter, I urge you to follow us as APTU on Twitter. We can be found at @Thameslink Users, and I will put on there that the materials are all available in due course, which will probably be towards the end of the week. So again, it only remains for me to thank you all for coming. I was a bit fretful that I would have more people from the railway than I would from my attendees, and that's definitely not been the case. So it's really been appreciated for everybody for you to turn up. So with no more ado, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming, and enjoy a COVID-safe Christmas and all those sorts of good things that at this time of year it's appropriate to say, and to hope to see you on a train. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks all.